You know, this issue that we're talking about today is nothing new. It's been a challenge for us for a long time here in the region. Those of you who are working at the municipal level find that it's an issue that comes on your screen and has been on your screen. Our set of challenges. Many of those were discussed at a forum that was held back in December, of course, pre-COVID, and we were all able to meet in the same room. The Planning Commission joined forces with the Greater Keene Chamber of Commerce through that latter organization's regional issues series, in which housing was the featured topic. And I think that's where most of you were recruited as potential partners in this roundtable. And the idea of a roundtable is that we're not going to resolve the challenges in short order. We had a 2-hour session back in December, and we made some progress. No way can we resolve an issue in a 2-hour session, and nor will we in this session that we have set up today with the roundtable. But the hope is, should you be willing to put some energy and take the issue, because on our own, it's going to be tough. Collaborative approaches will be necessary. We'll have to be innovative. And some of what we're going to hear about today are things that are happening in other areas of our state and elsewhere that might be helpful for us to take under consideration. Might those ideas resonate well here in Southwest New Hampshire? So I just want to welcome all of you who are able to join us today. We have an agenda that will allow to hear from some of the folks that have examples to share with us, ideas to share. And then we're going to also have spots where we can speak as a group. And we hope to hear from everybody. Don't be shy about participating. And let me hand it over to Todd. Take it from here.
Great, thanks, Tim. Everyone's quickly becoming a Zoom expert, but just to orient folks real quickly on how to participate today. So actually, I meant to mute everyone upon entering. I think that option was actually turned off. So just to let folks know, if in order to reduce background noise, if you use the mute icon in your lower left-hand corner, that'll just keep the conversation a bit clearer for folks and reduce the minimum or reduce the background noise. You can use the chat feature to ask questions and add comments, and we'll have opportunity for Q&A at the end of each agenda item, but just know you can use the chat feature. We'll be monitoring that, and we'll be able to communicate that to the speakers as needed. You can use the raise your hand feature if you want to ask a question verbally and you want to avoid crosstalk. You can click on the participants icon, and that will bring up a menu where you can raise or lower your hand, and we'll be looking, monitoring that as well, so we can call on folks for questions and answers. Just a few other things. It's a raise your hand. I think most people are joining via the web, but if you're on your phone alone, just calling in without using a computer, you can use *9 to raise your hand. And again, the mute icon is helpful for turning your microphone on and off. If you're on your phone, you can unmute or mute yourself using *6. And if you have any technical difficulties, feel free to send a message to the chat or call our office line at 603-357-0557. Someone there will be able to help you out if you're experiencing difficulties that we can't resolve in the meeting. So that's the how to participate overview. Before jumping to the presenters, we did want to share a little bit about what you all consider priorities and what you might be looking to accomplish by participating in this group. Thanks to everyone who completed the pre-meeting poll. And since this digital format isn't quite as interactive as a in-person meeting, important in terms of housing issues in the region. And 100%, the top item that people thought was a priority, or respondents thought was a priority, was workforce housing, making sure that everyone in our workforce in the Monadnock region can find quality, affordable housing. So unanimous there, and some of the other priorities at the top of the list: retrofitting existing housing to meet our current housing needs, looking at how regulations are impeding greater housing options in our region, and all these are important issues. I find it hard to pick and choose which are the most important, but this is what we heard back from you so far. And I will just note quickly that people did note that, historic conservation, addressing homelessness, and thinking about how housing affects climate and the environment were some other things that were important to folks. In terms of what we heard you want to accomplish as by working as part of this group, so far we've heard through the survey that learning from others. What have other communities done to date to expand housing options? What strategies have they used to move the housing issue forward? And developing a plan for our region that evaluates what our current housing needs are, and maybe inventories some of the strategies we might consider pursuing to expand housing options. So I think these top priorities reflect where we are at the moment. We're exploring, we're at the front end of the conversation, and maybe as time moves on, some of the perhaps more substantial undertakings, like establishing an organization that can advocate for housing issues on a region-wide basis. That wasn't a top priority at the moment, but consider over the course of today's meeting and perhaps future conversations, does what you're learning, does that reinforce what your priorities are, or does it change what your priorities are? With that, I think I want to introduce our first. Can you? I see that. I think I see you're on the line, but I just want to make sure that your audio is good to go and you're able to communicate. George, can you?
Can you hear me now?
I see that you've unmuted yourself. Yes, I can hear you, George.
Great.
Yeah, I just want to thank George of New Hampshire Housing for joining us today, and along with Sarah Wrightsman from the Seacoast Workforce Housing Coalition. Both George and Sarah are going to share a little bit with us about the housing landscape across the state. What have been some trends before the COVID pandemic? Maybe how does our current public health emergency, how might that affect housing issues? Strategies and that have been used across the state to work on housing, education, advocacy, and just and moving the housing conversation forward. So George, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen so you can share yours. I know you have some slides, so let me just stop sharing my screen and let me know if you're able to share your PowerPoint presentation.
Hey, Todd. Tim here. While you're doing that,
Yeah, Tim.
I just want to say what a guy is George for joining us yet again. Most of you will recall George having joined us for the Regional Housing Forum, and he's even got more to say. So, George, we really appreciate you.
Well, thanks. And I seemingly always have things to say about housing and engagement and trying to, I guess, tackle this sort of ongoing challenge of housing as it relates to our understanding of community, economy, the people that are living here. And so, I'm happy to talk with you all. I'm glad for such a good turnout and the interest in trying to do something to keep us all sort of aware and maybe understanding some things to do next. If I've shared my screen right, you should see a title slide up there. Is that working out, Todd?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. And so one of the things that I just wanted to reiterate without going too deep into the data again, and again, as I've said in some of my conversations around, help to provide context, but there's so much more that needs to happen beyond that to have a real understanding of what's going on in our region and in our communities. And so I just wanted to let sort of people know where things were at, as Todd mentioned before, and maybe at the slightly beginning of what was happening with the coronavirus pandemic. This is comes out of our housing market snapshot. We do 3 reports a year, housing market report. We've turned those into maybe more frequent bi-monthly snapshots because, quite frankly, it's really hard to sort of look at what data's saying and kind of look into the future that easily. But just to show from the last couple of years what our closed sales were looking like, things were trending pretty closely in terms of the number of sales you can see in that top chart up there. And all through, and then as we looked at the median sales price, again, looking at, continued upward trend. The median was 305 in March as opposed to 275 a year ago. And there's still, as of right now, continued demand for housing in the for sale market, even though sales may have started to slower the inventory as people are pulling things off the market. But this is sort of where we're at right now through March. And you'll be familiar with this slide, those who were there back in December, are permits that were issued in New Hampshire. And post the recession, they've always been much lower as compared to before that. You saw a little bit of a change in March, not sure if that's some seasonality. So again, this doesn't really show what's happening in this pandemic situation, but I do want to sort of use this as a frame of reference of where we are right now with increasing home sale prices, inventory kind of going down, and not a whole lot of supply coming on the market in both the rental and the purchase market. This was last year's rent survey. You've seen this all through the recession of 2008. If there's anything that I could think about that might be some informative piece to look at what's happening now, the causation of this is not economic, it's flu. But this was what was happening in our market on the rental side. All through the recession, median rent went up, and so that's the midpoint, and it's gross rent, so it's rent plus utilities. We do an annual survey. This is it. Things like that. It's just long-term rentals. And so this was always a number that the two-bedroom, 1347 a month, which has always been seen as pretty high. It fluctuates all throughout the state, but the trend has been the same. So here in the Monadnock region, while I don't have slides showing this, it's not much different than in December, where we still had sort of essentially increasing rents, but not a lot of rental availability. On the vacancy rate side, we know that that balanced market is around 5%. And I remember, as Joanne Carr pointed out back in January to Peterborough meeting, that the only time we might have achieved some of that balanced market was when we were in a recession. And 5% isn't really meaning that there's a ton of vacancies in the rental side. I won't go into prognosticating what's going to happen in the future, but I'm curious what might be different about where people go in this environment versus the last one. So this is where we're at a vacancy rate below 1% in the Monadnock region. It was still very low as we sampled the city of Keene and other communities. So not a lot available on the market. And so what does that look like now in terms of what's happening in an environment where there's the COVID, the coronavirus has caused businesses to have to close, non-essential businesses. You don't need me to say that there's been a tremendous spike in unemployment. When we looked at the numbers, even back in the recession of 2008 and 9, that the weekly spike was nothing like what we're seeing now. Yet oddly enough, in the employment world, there's businesses that are thriving. And so we've got, to my view, and I'm sure you have a better sense of what is going well and what isn't. Certainly the hospitality industry and non-essential businesses, hairstylists. And so that rise in joblessness impacts income and obviously the ability to pay rent and mortgage. What's sort of trying to keep that supported is on the mortgage side, that there's forbearance that's now being deployed, and moratoriums on evictions. But as we know, this month, just a few days ago, May rent and May mortgages came due, along with mortgages and credit being paid by landlords to their creditors. I do know that in looking at some latest figures from the Mortgage Bankers Association, the overall share of home loans in forbearance rose to about 7.5% in the last week of April. It's gone up about a half a percentage point in the prior week, with and the bank-based servicers are holding the biggest slice. What certainly we've seen in the housing market is those that have cash reserves, and that's a real challenge for trying to make ends meet. The mitigating factor of that is federal stimulus money. But when forbearance and moratoriums maybe come off, what will happen then? And so we're looking at a housing market that's hard to really predict, but there are people that are trying to figure out how to pay rent or mortgage, or can't, and then have to figure out how they're going to make up for that later on. New Hampshire's ownership in rental markets, as I just said, we were on strong footing prior to that. But housing markets in its new territory, we're seeing that buyers are some of them are engaged more in the market. Some sellers are now pulling their homes off the market, maybe trying to wait to see if maybe there's going to be a better market in the short term. And so some of that could be the impact of forbearance. What's on the plus side is we've got the lowest interest rates we've seen in a long while. And it's creating interesting markets. So this next slide, this is from CoreLogic, that tracks a lot of housing data, and you're looking at really by cohort what's been happening over the last few months. And so and these are home purchase applications, so not refinances. And we've seen certainly February and more pronounced in March is a real decline year over year of purchase applications from the silent generation, much older generation, the baby boomers in 1945 to 64, Gen Xers and millennials. And so I'm not sure what that's suggesting, that might be some younger folks are finding maybe their way into a purchase market that's been challenging, or that other people that can stay in their homes are just waiting to maybe make that other purchase. It's not really clear, but it'll be interesting to see what this shows in the next few months. And just so you know, as you read a lot about the housing market, certainly that those sales are still really strong right now, and it takes a while for an application to go through approval. So a lot of things we're seeing as those things just coming to their logical conclusion of home sales, going to the closing table, and then finally being purchased. So those pending deals have essentially gone to closing. In terms of New Hampshire housing, we saw our highest rate of applications back in March, so much so that we had to kind of increase our interest rates to slow that down. And a lot of that was because, as most banks are concerned about, is how do you make sure you pay your investors if buyers. So there's a lot of unpredictability going on. There are folks that are gainfully employed right now and those that aren't. But I think I go back to what I've said to almost everybody I've talked to, is that data aside, now more than ever, I think it's really, really important to understand what's happening with people in our communities, what they're thinking about, of how they're living, and what things may look like on the other end of this, for people's ability to stay in their homes or stay where they're living in their apartments. So with that, I just want to go back to what's been an ongoing thing. This isn't a new slide for people, but these housing challenges have been in place for a while. We still have an aging population with different needs. And when I looked at the survey responses, and certainly it's good to see that workforce housing is still a concern, because we oftentimes relate that back to our economic growth and stability, which is all sort of turned upside down at this point. But you realize that, when you look at those categories, a lot of them are interrelated. You can address one issue and maybe help solve the concern about aging in place for older people, or people that want to age maybe somewhere near where they live because they want to downsize. And that gets to kind of the impacts of what people are thinking. That second bullet point, younger adults, we know this, they've got higher debt. As you look back to that core logic slide, a lot of millennials are interested in trying to find homes and might be seeing this as opportunity. Maybe they feel less concerned about the pandemic, or maybe they feel more comfortable about their employment situation and trying to take hold of that opportunity. I mentioned about older adults. We know that to be the case. That popped up on your survey. And that we do still have, and we talked about this in December, kind of a mismatch. So the older the houses are, they're sort of bigger, hard to sort of move in and around, have many bedrooms for maybe 1 and 2 people in them. Are there opportunities there? And that's the thing I think is important for this group, because we're here not to sort of necessarily look at data and what's it telling us, but what do we have now for options in terms of our own housing inventory? And when we ask ourselves, what are the current and future residents of the region need? And that's hard. It's hard to maybe know. But when we talk about this and relate it back to what's going on in our economy and jobs, what's the workforce requirement needed, it's important to think about what's then available to them in terms of what they're desiring. And that gets to maybe land use regulations and others. And I think about, when I think of words now, and they were the same before, but even more so now, is how are our communities set up to be resilient and responsive to not only the housing needs, but the changing economics landscape as well. And so I've always talked about, in terms of allowing development to happen or not, what are some of the things that, with our efforts to stop things that we don't want to have happen, actually really impede the opportunity to be resilient, to be responsive, and to try to have the opportunity to have creative solutions happen without having to go through a lot of red tape, realizing and valuing the fact that we want to hold up high the value of what our community character is like, our sense of value on conservation, and all those other really, really important things, historic landmarks and places. And those other housing challenges, yes, demand is very similar for older and younger people, and that one-size solutions don't necessarily apply. And through this, and I'll just share that the interesting thing that we've all learned in sort of the housing advocacy field is that generally, you know, there's a real deep understanding that we've got a housing crisis. We need to have places for our workforce. When it really comes down to where that's going to be, that's where the conversation really becomes the most challenging, and that's where the real hard work has to be done. And so one-size solutions don't apply, but moreover, we need to sort of understand what's the problem, what's the opportunity, and that becomes something that helps inform what a solution is. And oftentimes there's this sense to go to solutions first. For me, I think let's get it so we understand what the problem is, who and all the broad groups of people we're trying to make sure we're caring for and attracting. Because certainly if we want to attract people to our community, it's more than just housing, it's what else do we offer in our community. And so that local resistance is really, really difficult and challenging. And I think this is where proper engagement helps us understand what those issues are, and help bring them into the conversation so we can all be enlightened about what kind of response might work. And then there's other factors that influence the ability of the market to respond, and I'll get to that. And so when I say that, you know, this is a familiar slide to people, and while it might look like solutions, regardless of what's happening with an economic growth, economic downturn, the impact of a virus, is that do we just allow the opportunity for creative housing solutions to happen so that it doesn't take long for those solutions to bear themselves out? So you see that missing middle. What financial wherewithal to do so? Do you make that difficult for me? And some communities do. And they make it so difficult that maybe it even goes against their own conservation goals and ideals. But this gets back to a person that I've learned a lot from. That's Chuck Marone in Strong Towns, and we put one of those things on your reading list, that we think about the opportunity for just allow incremental development. As opposed to the 30 and 40 unit building we all get concerned about. It may take a long time, but I kind of have faith in that as being a long-term solution, in a way that it helps. Getting back to your survey, how in here, if we allow this to happen, does it help a person age in place, or age in their community, or bring a new person in that has high debt load and trying to find a place to make roots because they're working for one of your local employers? And that's important for big employers and our small business community. That's the bedrock of New Hampshire, certainly. And you've heard this before, and so the reason why I put this in here, because I don't want to go through a tutorial on it, is that as we try to talk as a group to personalize this challenge of housing, and I know the survey said what housing do we need, but if we were in person, we'd be talking a lot about our own housing trajectory. We did that in Peterborough back in January, so that we can make this real. But when it comes to try to thinking about the interconnectedness or the interrelationship of things, it's important to understand that, and this is when I go to Chuck's 5 immutable laws of affordable housing, which I don't think was on the initial list, was that, tenants and home purchasers are the ones that pay the cost of development. So when we make it, challenging for a developer, we make it more expensive for someone to buy and more challenging for someone to rent. But, certainly the cost of lumber, the availability of labor are important things to think about when we think about how to address problems here, especially if we're thinking about new development. And then land, it's finite, we know that, but how we choose to be able to use that land can help change how intensely it might be used and what that means for our own communities, even revenues and as well as being able to take care of the people we want to invite in into our communities. Certainly loans and financing impact how things are created, whether I'm a capital D developer or I'm a homeowner trying to do a detached or an attached accessory dwelling unit. And then our regulatory practices have a lot to do. If we want to allow things to happen and be mindful of how much things cost for developer, trying to make things affordable, it's really important to look at predictability and the timeline for getting things done in our communities. And so that's a lot to take in as we tackle just what is our issue here locally in our community by community where things happen, but also the fact that housing and our economy are both regional and need a regional approach, even though in the end it's going to be a cumulative effort of what we do in Jaffrey, Peterborough, Swansea, and the like. And so I think for me, that's where I kind of want to get to some of the endpoints, is that Malcolm Gladwell is an author that maybe people know about. He's very thought-provoking. And I thought this was good. His quote is, and this is in one of his, not his latest book, but Blink, the Power of Thinking Without Thinking. The key to good decision-making is not knowledge, it's understanding. We're swimming in the former, definitely lacking the latter. What I take away from that is that in my 10 years learning about the economics of development, the importance of those workforce housing people, and the fact that if you want to provide a density and bonus, there's got to be a certain percentage increase in density to allow for something to kind of calculate out mathematically. But in the end, we have to understand how those things interrelate. So we can be knowledgeable about how to make a project come to fruition about housing, but we have to understand our values in the community, the connection to the people that are there, to our historic elements, to our conservation elements, so that nothing goes ahead of the other, so that our solutions are something that people feel like they can live with and are a part of. And understanding, I think, is more of a two-way street as opposed to just knowledge that we sort of impart on someone. I think understanding is a two-way street, and that sort of, to me, will be a segue, I think, to engagement that Sarah's going to talk more about. And so with that, you know, I'm again appreciative of the number of people on the call, many faces and names that I know have been really working on this, and in some cases have a lot more anecdotal and longer term knowledge of how they've been dealing with this conversation in their communities. But I do want to offer that certainly New Hampshire Housing provides our assistance and lots of publications and information, as well as grants to help you out in the work that you're doing, community by community, group by group, and region by region. So I think that would be my segue. I think this is my last slide, and yes, it is. I think I saw a hand raised, but I'm gonna end there and stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, George. You know, I think before jumping to Sarah, I think it would be helpful to allow some opportunity for questions and comments. I do see Karen has her hand raised, and if others have thoughts about what George has shared, you know, he shared some information about market trends. You know, maybe there's other information that as people interested in housing issues would be helpful in that work. Maybe folks have thoughts about how COVID-19 is changing their short-term and perhaps long-term housing priorities. And George also shared some challenges and impediments to housing, expanding housing options. So if folks have thoughts or questions about challenges that George identified, maybe there are others that come to mind. You can raise your hand again through that participants icon in your lower menu. And And if you feel really moved to speak, unmute your microphone and feel free to participate that way. But Karen, since you had your hand raised first, I want to give you the first opportunity to speak.
Thank you. Thanks, Todd, and thank you, George. Thanks,
Yeah.
Tim, and for everybody being on the call, and the 6 people from Peterborough who hopped on. Woohoo! Good to see you guys. You know, my question really has to do with this balance we're perhaps going to need to strike between, and Todd, you alluded to this, the long-term direction for our community around housing and housing policy, and what's coming up. You know, we're expecting, you know, probably 2 to 3 years of this kind of up and down, kind of surging and backing off and surging and backing off with this virus. And we have not contended with this before. We don't know what this is really going to do. And I'm really thinking about, you know, how does this change the game in terms of our conversations as a task force around what our community needs and wants for housing, and that in the long term, and in fact, the more emergent or the more urgent needs that are going to appear. So it's this broader question that I'm grappling with, and I'm wondering if others are grappling with it as well, and maybe we could have some conversation about that.
Thanks, Karen. George, do you have any initial reactions to that? You know, just thinking about long-term versus short-term priorities. Right. And I mean, I think you mentioned it's really hard to predict at this point. There's so much uncertainty.
It really is. And I'll say what a lot of places have been concerned about is our homeless population and how to care for them in an environment where it may be difficult to be socially distant. There's been a lot of money and resources placed on that because that is a really, really emerging need. Because when you're there and you're infected, where do you go? And so there are people that are concerned about where am I going to go next when eviction order is lifted, and when forbearance is lifted, and what does that mean for me as a homeowner? Do I have to pay a lump sum? Is it going to be a balloon payment at the end? Are you going to rewrite my loan so that I can go out another 30 years? But and I think a lot of communities have tried to do that. When I've been present in Peterborough or in Jaffrey or in other places, we're asking the question of ourselves, what are you concerned about most right now? And then we've got to figure out what are we able to respond to doing? And I don't know the answer to that, but the thing I wish is that if there's some creative housing related solution, I really hope that our land use regulations that I know are very thoughtfully put out don't become the primary constraint to enacting those solutions. That's my concern. And it's still, you can't in this pandemic say, we're gonna let's build 80 units here. And again, we don't build it. We have to create the conditions that the market can respond. And I don't know what developers are thinking about. Oddly enough, in my house, I've got a builder that's able to be in my house because it's being renovated, and so I'm affecting others. So this social aspect is a whole nother layer. So that's not an answer, but I would now as much as ever want to hear what people are thinking so that we can try to think, what do we need to do to respond? I know Josh is on the call. What's he thinking in his regard? I know from our perspective, if there's additional funds that come to New Hampshire Housing from extra stimulus, we're looking at how do we keep our tax credit projects going if that's not something that businesses are able to or want to help fund because it's a tax credit related process. So we're trying to be prepared to do certain things with money, but that's just one element.
Thanks, George. And because you referenced Josh, I'm going to invite him to respond. So Josh, your mic's unmuted. So if you have something to contribute, feel free.
Sure, thanks, and thanks for hosting us. Well, I think from Keene Housing's perspective, and I know I speak for most of the housing authority folks I know, both in New Hampshire and nationally, we have, and I know everybody's heard me say this 100 times, but in the best of times, we have a multi-year wait list for our units. So now we're facing a situation where I think there's going to be profound job loss, and the tail on the economic impacts of COVID could last years. And I think what we need to prepare ourselves for, what Keene Housing, but the community and the nation, frankly, needs to get ready for, is our wait lists are going to probably triple or quadruple in the next year. And unless there is a public policy response to that, I think, George started appropriately with what's going on at the shelters. And I think what we're going to find is the shelters, which are already full all the time, there's going to be waits for shelter beds. I mean, the economic impact of this is going to be long and profound. And I think from Washington down to City Hall, there needs to be a really serious and thoughtful discussion like the one that we're having now about what is the combination of inputs that get us to help at least address minimally what we see coming down the pike.
Thanks, Josh. I want to invite Med Kopczynski from the city has had his hand up, so I want to invite him to speak.
Sure, and I hope I don't misspeak by any means. George, I agree with a lot of what George says. I did share with the group a draft housing inventory that we did and presented to the city council right before the COVID hit. And we did a deep dive on data, assessing data to take a look at issues such as housing pricing and rentals, rental versions, et cetera. And what we're seeing in the data is, we think, a significant need, not for development or redevelopment or any sort of regulatory impact. What we're seeing is a real need to do renovations and rehabilitations of our existing housing stock, especially when we focus on workforce housing, as a goal. So I think that the conversation can't be just only about development. It has to concern redevelopment, especially if we're going to make statements such as, reducing our carbon footprint and things like that. The most efficient most efficient building from that standpoint is using your existing stock as opposed to building brand new. The other side of that is we are going to see an increase in the need for housing, especially on the lower end. And I dare say, having dealt with this for quite some time, that we should start thinking of homelessness and homelessness response probably beyond the role of local government, and probably elevate that discussion to the state level. I think that the issue is too big for the city of Keene to deal with on its own, or the town of Swansea to deal on its own, or the town of Peterborough to deal on its own. It probably needs a better response than that, than simply just allowing or trying to have the local jurisdictions deal with it. The problem is too big from that standpoint. So having said that, I'll be quiet for a little while.
I would just say I think those are good observations. I don't think, and if it came across that way, I'm not just thinking about new development. I say incremental development from a standpoint of, if you've got old housing stock and you want to convert that, you've got to allow it to be converted, number one, in a place that only allows single family detached. My 5-bedroom Victorian can't be retrofitted. And I would agree, we don't need to take up more land, but I go back to that missing middle, and I think, how do we allow the market to be responsive to some of those things? I certainly agree about the homelessness. That's going to take a real partnership, local, state, federal. However, and if it's done anything, it's sort of pushed that awareness to the forefront. All of us will be able to take. But Matt, I think your comments are good, and I think and when I also think incremental, I sort of think that way as a homeowner. Can I do some things to shore up what I can do and maybe add housing stock, because the supply is still low. But you're right, if we can do it in an existing home, as long as there's it can be done and paid for, it's a great idea.
Yeah, I agree. And with the missing middle housing and retrofitting existing housing stock, it would be interesting, at least from my perspective, to evaluate how much of our housing demand could be met simply through adapting our existing housing stock. I don't know the answer to that question, but it might help us as a region in terms of guiding our priorities. Elizabeth, you've had your hand up for a while, so I want to invite you to speak.
Hi, thank you. I'm Libby Reinhardt from Peterborough. I'm part of the Peterborough Housing Task Force and a resident in Peterborough. Not a sophisticated housing person at all. It seems to me, my husband and I have 4 millennial children in cities across the country, 2 in New York, 1 in Chicago, 1 in Denver. And what we're hearing and what we're seeing, we also have a grandson in high school in New York City, and trends to look at. I don't know the answer at all. I don't think any of us do, but trends to look at post-COVID or in the middle of COVID is what kind of housing are people going to want going forward? There will be changes in that. These New York City kids are saying, wow, we love New York City and we love Chicago, but we can't see our friends anyway. We can't go out. And so they're looking at moving out of the city. They can go to school out of the city remotely. Andrew Cuomo's talking about more, remote learning. Certainly the colleges are grappling with this. So I think trends that will become clear over the next year or so are whether the demand for housing or the types of housing demands changes drastically, where people want to live changes drastically. And what that means for us is twofold. One, there might be a much bigger demand for living in this kind of region, which would put an upward pressure on prices, clearly. And also, I don't know again, our millennial kids in these cities have jobs that lend, that they can work from home. So it doesn't matter that has a job that they can do from home. Certainly construction and that kind of stuff you can't. But it seems that there are going to be housing trends, that are going to change drastically from any assumptions we've had up to date.
Thanks for sharing. I'm not seeing any other hands raised at the moment, and I have an eye on the clock. So I think at this point I want to introduce our second presenter, Sarah Wrightsman from the Workforce Housing Coalition of the Greater Seacoast. Sarah has been kind enough to be part of the conversation as we organize this roundtable, and has offered to share with us a bit about her work in the Seacoast region. Here in the Monadnock region, I think we're, as I mentioned earlier, at the beginning stages of a regional conversation. It might make sense at this point, or we thought at this point it made sense to learn what other regions have done to work on housing advocacy. So Sarah has been kind enough to share a bit about her work, and there might be lessons that we in the Monadnock region can learn from the experience on the Seacoast. So Sarah, Is your mic live? And I see you've shared your screen, so that's a good sign.
Yeah, I think I'm good to go if you can see my screen.
Great, perfect. Thank you.
So thanks so much, Todd. Thanks to all of you. It was a really good sort of discussion. We could probably talk about this all day. I hope it's okay. My presentation is going to make far fewer references to the current pandemic. I'll try to be sensitive to the fact that this is sort of what we're dealing with right now and could be for a long time. Some of our work and our tips for advocacy and the formula of what that work looks like is not, you know, pandemic approved, not physical distancing approved. So I'm going to talk about advocating for change at the local level. So the Workforce Housing Coalition is a grassroots nonprofit. Our mission is to advocate for housing affordability, availability, and diversity. So we want more housing. We want housing that's affordable to members of the workforce, and we want a more diverse supply of housing. We do that primarily through engagement, education, and advocacy work, although we also do some technical assistance stuff, some convening work, and I can talk about that too. So this is our roadmap to change. I'm not going to go over this, so don't feel like you have to memorize it. This is what our work looks like. So once we've chosen a priority community, so we work all over the Seacoast, all the way actually from Nashua up to Kennebunkport, Maine. So we have a very large service area, the Greater Seacoast. And so this is what our work looks like once we've chosen a priority community. You know, we spend some time getting to know that community. Instead of going over this, I tried to distill it down to what this would look like. What are the sort of formula for advocacy, the steps to advocacy at the local level that citizens or business leaders could take. So starting with, you know, for me, I'm often working in communities that I don't know, or in some cases have never heard of. My apologies to Pelham. I had never been there until I started working there on a workforce housing charrette. So what do you need to know about the community? It's good to get an idea of the history. Is this a topic that they've been talking about for a long time? Is it something that's controversial in this community? Is it something that's not on their radar, or maybe hasn't been on their radar for a long time since the passage of the workforce housing law? It's great to get a little bit of data, and George is an awesome resource for getting data. New Hampshire Housing in general does great data collection, and George is a great resource for talking about that data. And data is part of the story, but it's certainly not the whole story. And so even more importantly is collecting personal stories and getting qualitative data about what the impact is of this issue on residents and on businesses. So really understanding the scope of the problem in a human way, on the people scale. And then understanding the opposition also has some value, and I don't want to spend too much time talking about that. So what I did was drop our housing fact sheet in the chat box so you can download that file. The housing fact sheet tries to bust sort of the top 9 myths about workforce housing. It has not been updated to reflect pandemic-specific myths. So like the sort of idea that density has a correlation with a higher incidence of coronavirus, which there is some data available that starts to bust that myth, but we haven't updated our fact sheet to include that yet. But not bringing up the opposition and not, you know, putting it out there, but just knowing what the opposition is likely to say so that you can be prepared to respond to it. Thinking about who you need to know, because relationships are everything and relationship building is everything in this work. We are a coalition, and this really is about coalition building. And you all are already off to a great start, especially those of you in Peterborough. There's 6 or so of you here, but the 35 of you or so who are in this call are sort of a coalition. You know, you found your allies and your supporters and your partners in this work. It's also good to know your decision. And it's great if you can connect with experts. So you've already done that because you've got George here for the second time. It's good to know who your decision maker is, and by that I mean sort of who your decision maker is, but also how the decision-making process happens. So if we're talking about zoning, which is the primary part of our work, is talking about changing local land use regulations. It's good to know what type of government you have and what type of government you're working with, and how zoning changes move the way through the process. And sometimes you might be talking about state policy instead, and then I know there's a state rep in here. that getting to understand sort of how this happens on a state level and making state level policy change is great too. And then understanding what resources are available. And so I recommend not starting with solutions. Don't lead these conversations with solutions, rather lead them with the scope of the problem and encouragement and ideas and enthusiasm for reaching a solution collaboratively together after you've achieved some sort of shared vision that you can work on. And taking every opportunity to advocate and engage and educate folks. So I'm going to go through those in more detail. So thinking about what you need to know, understanding the history. And so right now our priority community is Durham, New Hampshire, and we've been working on a sort of a modified workforce housing charrette in Durham for a little more than a year. This was originated because we had a contact at UNH and decided to do a student project. So my students are working remotely on this Durham charrette that we had to modify both for the pandemic and, you know, them moving to a remote learning structure. And so they've done a great job of sort of understanding the history of this issue in Durham and interviewing the stakeholders. They've done focus groups with, you know, leaders here and Durham residents and business owners. They understand the opposition, or at least sort of the gist of what is the very specific tailored to Durham, New Hampshire, you know, thing that they don't like about workforce housing. What's that barrier that's holding them back? They've also collected personal stories. They watched the documentary Communities and Consequences at the beginning of the semester and were moved by that and found that to be more compelling than just hearing from me about the data. And so that was a really great step that we took to get them really invested in this project. And again, data has its place and data is important. Keep it simple and use the experts. So take advantage of your connection with George. Keeping in mind though, that you don't need to be an expert to be an advocate. Don't feel like you have to wait until you know everything there is to know about housing. So don't feel like you need to be a housing expert. You really don't. You're already an expert on your personal story and you're already an expert on understanding why this is so important to you. And keeping in mind that at the end of the day, George says this so well, it really is about people and understanding who works in your community and who lives in your community and, you know, what is the issue that your region's housing is a regional issue and economic development is a regional issue. Most people don't work and live in the same community. So understanding who works in your region and who works in your community and who lives in your community and who lives in the region and can they afford to live in your community? And these are the people who, I mean, I don't have a picture of a nurse on this slide, but these are the people who literally right now are still working and are still doing this hard work because they have to. And so thinking about, you know, nurses and teachers who shifted to remote learning without, you know, a lot of notice. So just keeping in mind that it really is about people and no matter how much data, you know, you gather, it really is about this people story and thinking about the people who live in your community. So sort of the most important thing that you need to understand, and George hit this really well with talking about there is no one size. This is my just like absolute favorite quote from Jeff Gowan, who's the director of planning in Pelham, New Hampshire. He said, housing is a regional issue and you're part of the region, so you ought to be part of the solution. And that solution looks different for every community. And one of our philosophies is to come up with a tailored solution that is unique to that community that suits the character. But every community has to be part of the solution. And Strong Towns has this simple two-part rule for neighborhood change. No neighborhood can be exempt from change and no neighborhood should experience sudden radical change. So I have communities over here on the Seacoast that are frustrated because they feel like they're doing all the work. They're the ones who are experiencing radical change while the communities around them are experiencing no change. And so that's something that needs to be addressed. Every community has to be part of the solution. So thinking about who you need to know, relationships really are everything. And I'm going to use Durham as an example again. The first thing that I did when I was kind of getting to know this community and getting to know the issue was I had one-on-one meetings with people in the business community, people, you know, other people who were supporters. So I found my allies and I met with them and I did some sort of key informant interviews and got to know them and built that sort of foundational relationship for the rest of this work to go on. And I also met one-on-one with some town councilors and some other folks who are in, either my local elected officials, the local leaders, municipal staff, and really started to get to know them and got to know the decision-making process, and, found out how opposition was, how they expected the opposition to react, because typically the people who, say sit on the planning board, for example, already know who's going to show up at the planning board meetings, and they already know what they're going to say, because it's often the same people saying sort of the same basic things. Of course, in my case, I didn't have, well, I guess I invited George and other folks from New Hampshire Housing into the conversation. Ordinarily, I would recommend, if somebody wanted to do housing in Durham, I'd recommend that they reach out to me and connect with the Workforce Housing Coalition of the Greater Seacoast and take advantage of the expertise that's over there. So relationships really are everything. Start building them ASAP. And when you get to know, say, like a local decision maker, somebody who's on a council or a planning board member, they will have your back when you're there. I told George this story about when I was in Durham and I was presenting to the town council about data. There was a town councilor who was argumentative and not in a entirely respectful way, and because I had relationships with 3 of the other counselors, they shut him down. And that's just kind of the great thing that happens when you go to a public hearing or go to testify and you have sort of friends in the room, because you've gotten to know them and you know where they stand on these issues, and you have some allies. So again, who is your decision maker? I called 4 types of local government, just kind of walks through what that decision-making process looks like in each of New Hampshire's 4 types of government. Most of you probably already know, you probably are working with your community that you live in, or, and you're working with a community where you already sort of understand this and you already have a handle on what's going on in your community. Just in case you don't, that handout is in there. For me, it's incredibly useful because I'm often, like I said, I'm often working with communities that I really don't know. And knowing what resources are available. So I mentioned not leading with solutions. So when I went and met with some town councilors in Durham, I wasn't leading with, here's what I think you should do, even though I'll be, full disclosure, in this group, I knew exactly what I thought that they should do. I already had ideas about what I thought the right solution was, but it's much better and more effective if you can sort of persuade your decision maker into owning it. It's their idea and you came up with it collaboratively, and you went through the trouble of engaging community members and engaging decision makers and engaging, some key stakeholders, engaging the business community, and you kind of came up with a shared vision, and then you came up with your solutions and you worked on that together collaboratively as a local coalition. And this is something that we find too, where communities that already have a core group or had a core group because we helped them form it, of local individuals who are invested in this issue and already sort of have this going, are more likely to be successful, because at the end of the day, when I have 60 communities in my catchment area, I can go in and work with a community, but I can't stay there forever. So sort of this community engagement and building a coalition at the local level increases our capacity by sort of arming a group with what they need to understand moving forward, and what they need to sort of getting them all on the same page, and giving them a strategy and helping them build a strategy and work collaboratively together, so that now they can carry on forward with or without me there. So I will tell you about some great resources. You already have one in the room. That's George, and New Hampshire Housing is an awesome resource to you, and they have funding available for technical assistance. They have some great data, some great publications. They have George, also a great resource in and of himself. But I'm also going to talk about the Municipal Technical Assistance Grant Program, and I'm going to talk about UNH Cooperative Extension, because the tail end of this presentation is all about community engagement and how valuable it is and sort of how to do it. So the Municipal Technical Assistance Grant Program is funded by New Hampshire Housing, and it's administered by Plan New Hampshire. If you don't know Plan New Hampshire already, they're also a great resource for you. They do great work, design charrettes, community design charrettes, tackling some sort of design problem. I don't think that they've done any charrettes of their overall charrettes. So the MTAG program offers communities up to $20,000 with a 25% cash match. So you get $25,000 maximum to hire a consultant to help you explore expanded housing options, and sort of the end result of it is a zoning ordinance or a zoning ordinance amendment or something like that at the end of the day. Community engagement is a required component. UNH Cooperative Extension is sort of part of this program to help with that component of it. I know that there's folks in Peterborough on the call, and Peterborough has been the recipient of the MTAG grant twice. There are some other communities that always sort of come to mind when I think about communities who have taken advantage of the MTAG program and have had sort of varying degrees of success. Think about Rochester. The MTAG program there was incredibly successful, and it sort of revitalized ordinance that worked for developers and worked for them, and is going to help them just bring their downtown back to life. I also think of Exeter. They passed their zoning ordinance amendment pretty recently, but it shows a lot of promise and got great response from developers. And so I feel like that'll end up being a good example. And I know less about this one because it's not in my territory, but Jackson, New Hampshire took advantage of the MTAG program, and as a result created sort of an affordable housing trust that they used to fund some affordable housing activities. So that's the MTAG program. Applications are accepted on a rolling basis. You can apply anytime, and it is open to any New Hampshire municipality. So it's a great resource to take advantage of. I'm sure George can answer more questions about it specifically if your community is interested in applying, or reach out to Robin LeBlanc, who's the Executive Director of Plan New Hampshire. You can find her info at that link, and she'll even assist with, helping a community write it and troubleshoot and work through the scope of the project. So like I said, the rest of this presentation is all again going to be about sort of engagement, education, advocacy that happens at the local level, specifically community engagement, sort of what it looks like or what it can look like. So the key difference, start with sort of just defining this, the key difference between engagement and outreach. Engagement is two-way communication. So you're giving your listeners, your participants, an opportunity to talk back, and outreach is one-way communication. So outreach is like flyers and press releases, anything where you're putting the word out, and you could use outreach to advertise an engagement opportunity, but engagement really requires the ability for people to be able to respond and feel like they're influencing policy. So there's two types of engagement, thick and thin engagement. I think most people are familiar with thick engagement. It's when you have the community or community members come to you. So listening sessions, focus groups, key informant interviews, anytime where you're sort of asking people to come to you, versus thin engagement is anytime that you're meeting them where they're at. So one of my favorite examples and one of my favorite ways to use thin engagement is to do like poster board voting, where you put a poster board somewhere. So it's really great if you can get it somewhere everyone will go. Maybe, schools, depending on what you're doing, but like I'd love to put it at like a Dunkin' Donuts, like something where I know there's going to be a lot of traffic of local people. You can put it in the town hall, and people will see it when they go to, register their cars or their dogs. And you just put a poster board there with a prompt or a question or, some sort of voting mechanism, and you give people the supplies, either, a pen or a marker or some dot voting, and have them, vote on it. And you can collect feedback from the public that way in a way that's incredibly passive and will reach people that you otherwise won't reach because they won't go. And if you can put it somewhere where a lot of people will go, and if you can put it somewhere for a long time and have multiple boards where maybe you move it around, it's in city hall or town hall for a bit, and then you move it to the library, and then you move it to the local Dunkin' Donuts or the gas station, or something that you're going to rely on a lot of people to be able to go through, something with a lot of foot traffic. I also like surveys. A lot of people don't, and that's okay too. I think they're a great way to get sort of passive, easy feedback from people who might not show up or might not participate in other ways. And it's great when you can work through community groups to distribute things like surveys, like if you can send something home with the kids at the school, in their backpack for their parents to see. It's a good way to ensure that you're getting a good kind of segment of the population, particularly parents who are often not getting feedback from because they're so busy. And like I said, community cooperative, UNH Cooperative Extension is awesome. They really are, like Molly Donovan is the queen of community engagement. They really are the great resource for this. So we gave you this link And there's another one that we can send out, but we gave you this link as part of your sort of pre-reading. You hit the download resource button right here, and you can download the resources, the tools for community engagement from Cooperative Extension. They're really great, and they'll help you sort of create a community engagement plan. There's another resource that they have, the community engagement chart, that can help you sort of literally fill it out. And at some point, if we can gather in person, or maybe they'll move it to virtual, or eventually there may be another community engagement academy, which is like a 3-day, you really like get hands-on learning about community engagement as a tool. So for those of you who are really interested in doing this and tackling this issue, that might be a useful resource. George and I have both been through it and have great things to say about it. So our engagement philosophy with the Workforce Housing Coalition does, we like to create a shared vision to lead our work. So really, like, the first thing I do when I get into a community is kind of create a group of stakeholders that will be the group that will carry this ball forward, build a local, coalition, and create that shared vision, and really think about getting really specific with this community. There's kind of pros and cons for me of being an outsider doing this work in a community I don't live in. If for many of you, you're probably going to be doing this work or thinking about doing this work in a community that you do live in, probably know your community better, and you know who the key players are, and you know the history a little bit better, and your sort of voice may be heard or be more important. Some people really like the sort of outside expert thing and bringing that in. So it all depends on your community. There's pros and cons to both. So recognizing that every community is unique, and they should be too. Their solution should be too. This is just so true. Like, we're not going to offer up the same solutions or take the same approach with a rural community we would with an urban one. Just totally different ways to do this and to tackle this housing crisis. And it's not just about sort of the type of housing. That point that Med made about Keene was really sort of poignant with me, because it was very similar to the work we did in Sanford, Maine and Rochester, New Hampshire, where their problem wasn't necessarily a housing affordability problem, albeit everyone has a supply problem right now. So I think we need more housing everywhere. But thinking about how to take advantage of, I think of like downtown Rochester, how to take advantage of all of these like vacant, dilapidated buildings and make better use of them. And there were a lot of regulatory barriers, but it wasn't necessarily an affordability or like a need for new development. It was really a need for like, okay, how do we spur redevelopment and rehab these buildings and get them up to code, and, make some improvements to the facade and make them livable again and make them worthwhile and useful, places for people to live. George unmuted himself, so I'm assuming he wants to say something.
No.
Oh, good.
Just preparing for when I want to unleash. Yeah.
And the last thing is, if you've done your job well, you won't be surprised when it's time for the vote or the decision at the end of the day. So this stuff can take years, unfortunately, and sometimes you do all of this education and advocacy work, and then a NIMBY group comes out, and that's just, it's okay, it happens. And sometimes you get to the time where you're ready to vote, and if you haven't done quite enough community engagement, or if you haven't done quite enough education, or if the NIMBY group is just way stronger than the YIMBY group, then sometimes you are surprised when it comes to the vote. But if you've done your job really well and you sort of understand and have the pulse on the community, you shouldn't be surprised when it's time for the vote or sort of the decision at the end of the day. The most important thing is recognizing that everyone has a housing story. So again, and I love to reiterate this, you don't have to be an expert to be an advocate. Your personal story has so much power and is so compelling with a decision maker. I sit on my town's planning board, and like I said, there's a state rep somewhere in this meeting, and I'm sure there's other folks who sort of sit in these decision making seats, where hearing someone's personal story is just going to be so much more compelling than hearing about, how many open jobs there are on Indeed, or, whatever sort of the data is saying. Would refer you to my friends at New Futures. They are a nonprofit focused on health policy out of Concord. They do advocacy work and they do advocacy trainings. But one of the things that they do is teach people how to craft their own personal story. They teach them how to testify. They teach them how to do this like sort of, government one-on-one advocacy work. But a big thing tell a compelling story in order to change a decision maker's mind or influence a decision maker.
Sarah, I just dropped a link to New Futures in the chat box.
Thank you.
And one of the things because there's a lot of other trainings, and I know you've used them, they are kind of a resource that I came late to the game to understand. I couldn't find that one about the personal story. It might be in there, but they're very amenable, right? I mean, you could reach out and talk to them, and that may be helpful to this group as you're trying to piece together the next steps of what you want to understand in terms of that. And while we throw a lot of acronyms around, I know what everyone knows YIMBY and NIMBY means. And,
yeah, sorry.
But I also, I think that probably Sarah and I, and maybe some of you, suffer from the perils of this battle in the trenches, I guess. And it's such a weird way to describe it, because in my heart of hearts, I really believe that, not everyone's going to agree with the approach and what needs to be done. And I guess, to maybe, for me, put it in a better perspective, there will always be someone who's just dead set against something. But I think I never want to go into this thinking I've got opposition. There may be people with different values. And I think if I lead with the best I have in me, that I value and respect that, but still go forward. And I think that's important, and not to keep calling out Peterborough. I only live now through the articles I read, but I feel like even in an article I read that there's more work to be done, but there's an understanding that there are people that are invested. And the more that we're invested and invite others to be invested in the conversation, I just think it's the right thing to do, and it's also difficult. And I think what sometimes as maybe an advocate that may not always want to think strategically and do a campaign, although that word campaign was out there, I think we're the first ones to be like, gosh, what happened? Because it seems like we had a lot of people that understood things, but there was this clandestine group, and it's just, it's human nature. We need to be aware of human nature, and that maybe if we know the adage that there's 20% of the people that are going to be for something, 20% they're going to be dead set against, and 60% that we want to understand more, is maybe a valuable thing to recognize. And that to me is really the civic engagement, that without widespread enthusiastic sort of buy-in, that initiatives just fail.
Yeah.
And it's the word I use, it's iterative. There's still more people to bring to the table. There's more people that we need to come to their table. And that knowledge piece is the fact that, while, as Sarah said, oftentimes we can think of some be different than what we thought, and that's really a good thing.
Yeah, it was you can tell by that George is more sort of optimistic than I am.
I don't know about that, but I have to live by that axiom, and I see where it works in communities, that people find a way, using a bit of strength, muscle, relationship, being trusted, being truthful, building meaningful relationships, not trying to pull something out. That sort of golden rule thing, I think, is an important guide for us in this work.
Yeah, it's also a great segue to my next point. So George is totally right that there are people whose minds are just never going to change. And it doesn't really matter what you're talking about. There are people who are just sort of against everything as a general rule, and that's totally okay. So the key with that is making sure that they're not the majority, that, you don't have to have 100% of the votes. I think George said that he was going to talk. And so your voices and the voices of advocates or YIMBYs, the yes in my backyard people, is so important, because this is an article about a study that I love referencing. This study came out of Boston University's Initiative on Cities, and it demonstrated that overwhelmingly the people who show up at planning and zoning board meetings don't support housing development. And for those of us who sit on boards, we were sort of like, well, yeah, we already knew that. We didn't need a study to tell us that. But the key here is recognizing that there are minds that you can't change, and ensuring that you get more people, or at least enough people, who show up at these meetings when there is something that's really important happening, that are in support of it so they can weigh out and start to balance these voices. They don't even necessarily need to dilute the voices. They just need to be enough there to balance it, to give the decision makers a little bit of sort of something that makes them say yes and makes it okay to say yes, gives them a little bit of sort of bravery to do that. So I love this particular article about this study. It really made me think, and it was sort of made me wonder why YIMBYs aren't showing up more often. So this is my info. That's really all I had. I'm sure there are going to be tons of questions, so I can't wait to have this discussion. You are welcome to reach out to me anytime because I love talking about this. So I will give up my screen. Reigns, stop share.
Great. Thanks, Sarah, for that. That was really helpful, I think, in setting the, kind of a foundation for, this group to think about, how do we want to organize and engage and advocate on housing issues. I think the way, since we're already at 1:23, and I want to respect people's time, I think we'll merge whatever questions folks have for Sarah, and perhaps also invite people to comment on based on what you've heard today from George and Sarah. Are there certain ideas that resonated with you and you think are worth pursuing in Southwest New Hampshire? And more generally, what you would hope to accomplish by continuing to participate in this group and perhaps growing this group to include other stakeholders as the region thinks about how to advocate for expanded housing options. I see Elizabeth has her hand up, so I'm going to invite her to speak.
Okay. Muting myself.
Sorry.
Well, as part of the opposition in Peterborough during the last several years and being called NIMBY and worse, I just want to say right up front that we are all much more in agreement than we are in disagreement. And in Peterborough, it came down almost simply to a few dimensions and the rate of change of what was being tried. So to set up, Sarah, and I really like all the ways you've talked about community building and finding advocates and, and George too. I mean, all the hard work that you guys do is terrific. But I think the tone of this has begun to go off a little bit to something that is, begins to raise hackles a little bit. And I think if we could just not use opposition, NIMBY or YIMBY, I think everybody would be a lot better off. I think if we could find areas of agreement and go from there and see that the differences are way less than it has been blown up to be. So I speak from the opposition side.
Yeah, it's really good to hear that because I've never
called the opposition side.
Right. I've never heard that sort of referred to before, or heard any sort of pushback on those terminologies. It's good to know, and it's good something to be aware of. I recognize that folks who are opposed to housing are people who have stories and have their reasons, and their reasons are almost...
We're not opposed to housing. Let's just, right there, that sentence is not a good sentence. We're not opposed to housing. We're all wanting the same things. It's how fast you try to move and what the dimensions that you're trying to impose. It's so simple, and it's gotten, so nobody is opposed to housing. Nobody is opposed to helping our workforce. Nobody is opposed to any of that. And that's all I can say. I mean, you can keep saying, and I'll keep, but it's really, if we could have that conversation of where the differences are, it's pretty simple. At least it should have been in Peterborough. It wasn't, but that's a different story.
Well, and so I'll just add, I think that's a great point. And, as much as I'll use another terminology, workforce housing, I've always said, I just do not ever want to use that term. We know that it has certain other connotations. I'm thinking, who are the people that we want in this community, who are the people that we need now and in the future. And I agree, because I think these words come from the fact that it comes down to, you got 20 people in opposition at a planning board meeting, I got 30 people for. And I would say that's that your words are really important. And that's why I was sort of making those comments about that, because I think that we have to want to understand each other so we know where the common ground is, because we have our different thoughts on what we want in our communities, and they're interrelated with all sorts of other things. What do we see ourselves as part of the regional economy? What do we see as important in our communities? And those we all have to feel like those are being respected and protected and understood. And so I couldn't agree more. And I think it's what makes it really difficult. Personalities matter. Who's saying what, and how they're saying it. I think it's really, really important. So I appreciate those words. I think we have to remember that. That's why, as I talk about data, as much as I live in that world, I don't think the solution, I wouldn't want to come at you saying, here's the vacancy and the housing need. We did a housing study and Peterborough needs 350 units. What does that mean to people? It's not people. And I think that's an important thing. So I'll leave it at that. So I appreciate that.
Great, thanks, George. So I saw a few other hands raised. Erica, I see your hand's been raised. I'll invite you to unmute your microphone and speak.
Hi.
Yep.
Okay. Hi, thank
Hi,
you.
Erica. Yep.
So this has been all really great information, and I'm liking hearing this last piece of the discussion too about how to engage people in a different way that doesn't make them feel like the opposition. And for instance, one of the things that's really worked with me when I've been talking about housing is to do numbers. And I think that the documents that George provided are really powerful. And if you go on the New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority's website, you can find all those documents and all the research that they've done and the numbers. It's all broken down. But one of the things that really has resonated with some folks that I've talked to, because of that term workforce housing, which I also don't like, it's just got to be housing that people who live in your community can afford. But if you break it down and think about a 2-bedroom apartment in Hillsborough County, you'd have to make $1,115 a week to afford that apartment. So that would be $28 an hour, right? So if you're an LNA in the Peterborough area making $12 an hour, you have to have 2 of you living there, and a single mom generally doesn't. So that's just an example of how numbers can have power, because you want LNAs to be able to live in your community, and you want the food service people feeding your children to be able to live in your community. So I think that gives it that people first look that I think is so important. Is you wouldn't say, I don't want to build housing. That's not the conversation. That even if you're not someone who's always for certain kinds of housing, you wouldn't want to start a conversation that way. So if you bring those people and their actual stories, like Sarah was saying, into the equation, and you can find really easy ways to mesh those stories into actual data with those documents that George shared, and by going on the rental survey, and it gives you all the median costs of every county. So like for Cheshire County, it would be more like $860 a week you would need to make, because there's a difference between the Hillsborough median cost and like that. But I think that sometimes will help people who aren't feeling it. They're not feeling why do I need this? Why do we need more? So that's that people piece, I think.
Great, thanks, Erica. Stephanie, I see you have, Stephanie Hurley, I see you have your hand raised. Go ahead and.
Yeah, thank you. I share what Libby said about, really having a negative reaction to NIMBY being used. And I really appreciated what Erica said, because I'm also a member of the opposition group in Peterborough. And I really have a very strong feeling that I work in the schools. And, I have a very strong feeling that paras, for example, don't get paid enough to be able to afford houses that are presently being built in Peterborough as supposedly developments that I thought were supposed to be for workforce housing. So this is the problem, and I feel like I really like one of the statements that Sarah said, which is create a shared vision to lead the work and build a local coalition. And I feel like that's what we're trying to do in the housing committee, in the housing task force, is we're trying to get to a point where we can talk to each other and not call each other names and understand what the arguments are for and against, and try to find solutions within our own community using our own stock of housing, etc., and land area. And so I'm hopeful, and I appreciate your talk and your help, but I really don't appreciate, you know, the word that you used. So, but I'm here because I want to build that coalition. So thank you.
Thanks for that, Stephanie. And it sounds like, I'm not, I know that the folks in Peterborough have been doing some, this task force has been convened to work on housing issues in Peterborough. I can't say that I'm intimately familiar with that work, but it sounds like that group is already doing understanding and finding the right language to be talking to each other on, some difficult issues about, what type of community folks want to, live in, and what sort of housing options they think are a good fit for the place they live. So it sounds like you've already started down that path of having those hard conversations. So I can appreciate and the comments on how language matters. I do want to, if folks have additional comments or questions about engagement or education, I'd invite those, but I do want to, we're already past, our target time for wrapping things up. So I do want to say, invite folks to comment on some of the broader questions and that are up on the screen right now. And if anyone has specific thoughts about, what they would like to accomplish by working as part of a regional coalition on housing issues, I'd invite any comments on that front. Are there specific activities that folks might be willing to dedicate time and resources to? And thinking about moving the conversation forward, are there specific topics that you think would be worth discussing, in a virtual format similar to the one we're using today? I think we're still a ways away from a time where we can all come together in person. That was our original intent, was to have a rich conversation face to face, because it is easier when you're talking about issues like housing to have that face-to-face interaction, to really listen and respond to each other's housing stories. It's more difficult to do that in a virtual setting, but we're hoping to move the work of this group forward, as folks are interested. And Karen, I see your hands raised at the moment, so go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Todd. I want to just acknowledge the the process that we're in here, and say that one of the ways that we're operating the community task force on housing in Peterborough through the times that we're in is virtually. And what we've experimented with lately, which seems to be working, is that each person has an assignment of sorts that is back together as a group for discussion. And what Zoom allows you to do is break the group up into small groups. And so we've had, we did that for the first time the other night, and it split us up randomly into groups of 3 or 4, where we could have these smaller group discussions about what we had read, what we were learning, what we had learned, and what we were struck by. it accomplishes a couple of things. It allows everyone to have a chance to be heard, which, you know, doesn't happen when we have so many people and you have so many of us who dominate. So, including me, so I'll just say. And so that's an option. And I think, you know, I would prefer that rather than have more presentations, because in fact, you know, we can watch presentations on our own. I think coming back to talk to each other about it is much more engaging and creates that connection and those aha moments. So, so for me, that's that would be more useful in the regional setting as well. We would do that. We're doing that in Peterborough. If we could also do that regionally, that opens up a whole other series of conversations. That's my 2 cents.
Thanks, Karen. And I would invite, if that idea resonates with other attendees, I would encourage you to register that in the chat, this idea of maybe watching presentations outside of a virtual meeting and then coming back as a group and having a discussion using that presentation, or, you know, maybe it's an article as a springboard for conversation. What does this, you know, mean for our region? What does this mean for our town? What ideas can we adapt for our community? So again, if that's an idea that resonates, you know, feel free to express that in the chat. Tim, I see you have your hand raised at the moment.
Oh, thanks, Todd. I guess I just wanted to piggyback on what Karen was just talking about and Joanne put in the chat box, having to do with, and it's been mentioned a couple times during today's session, is that this is really a regional issue. And this is really why we were willing to, at the Planning Commission, to put forward the roundtable. And I think I got an idea based on what we've been talking about. I'll just float it. And, so tongue-in-cheek, maybe just a little bit, but if we could take the energy and staying power of commitment of the Peterborough contingent, the data and the experience of George and New Hampshire housing, and then somehow clone the enthusiasm and the ability to motivate that Sarah has in her work in the Seacoast, I think we got a winning recipe. But seriously, we wouldn't have been willing to sponsor this roundtable if we weren't serious about playing a role. We don't pretend at the Planning Commission that we have the answer, but we do recognize this as a regional issue and that it's very much integrated with many, many other issues that we deal with, whether it's been discussed in this roundtable having to do with economic development and changing demographics, and certainly our transportation system, our environment. These are issues that we work with in and out, and so to integrate the housing topic more so into the work we're doing, if there's value added in a regional dialogue and through this roundtable, or perhaps through forming a housing coalition, then that's really what we're putting forward. As I said at the outset, we didn't expect we were going to get to an answer today. But the ability to have some discussion and develop a trajectory. And I noticed that you have on the agenda, or we have on our agenda, next steps, and we're happy to continue this dialogue through another meeting of the roundtable, and perhaps develop an agenda that evolves over time. So just throwing that out, and happy to hear from some who haven't engaged yet in the discussion.
Hey, I'm going to hop in. I want to piggyback a little bit off of a lot of things that got said, but what Karen also just said, I think it's in order for us to really be valuable and be using our own time wisely, I think that we should use the Zoom time for engaging with each other. And in fact, I'm part of I work for Rights and Democracy. We have a similar model to New Futures, except that we're a membership, we have a sort of membership model, and we engage our membership in our activities. And storytelling is certainly a huge tool that we use. I'm also part of a health equity task force for the state, and we meet weekly, and I would really love to see us do a similar kind of setup where we break into groups. We've identified 7 areas of equity that we're addressing, with a focus on action. So anyway, I just want to throw that out there. That's been I think a really great group, but I also think that we should probably recruit and grow the group if that's what we plan to do.
Great, thanks for that. Thanks for that comment. And I'm hearing, you know, I personally haven't used the breakout function of Zoom. I've heard good things about it. That's definitely something we might want to consider in terms of having a more rich people on one call. So maybe that's a format we look into for the next meeting. You know, I see
I'm happy to
Erica.
help you out with that too.
Thank you for the offer. I do want to respect people's time. We can continue the conversation, you know, as people are willing. I just want to hit on the fact that you know, in terms of next steps, I do plan on following up with folks in terms of interest and availability in participating in another conversation, perhaps a more interactive format. I think today's meeting provided a good baseline foundation, and it sounds like people are ready to kind of dive in and have a more back and forth conversation. We were a little bit worried about how that would work over Zoom, but it seems like that. Another next step, you know, it's tough to cover everything in a meeting format. So, you know, people have been sharing resources in the chat. I'll make sure that those are compiled and maybe create a web page on the SWRPC site that can serve as a clearinghouse for some of this information. And I'll be sending out a poll to folks to gauge interest and availability in a follow-up discussion. Erica, I see you have your hand raised. Feel free to unmute yourself and chime in.
I was just going to answer one of the questions that you had on your screen.
Sure.
Number 2 is, what do you hope to? I can't remember the wording quite yet, but
accomplish. Yeah.
Yeah. What do you hope to accomplish? Well, for me, it would be just today, I have received 3 phone calls from single moms, all of whom are employed and all of whom are looking for housing for themselves and either their 1 or to 3 children. And so what I'm hoping to accomplish would be to be able to direct them to housing. Because right now, there's none. And I'm actually getting some of those referrals from landlords who they're being called about vacancies and availabilities. So if that would be the thing for number 2 that I would like to accomplish. I'd like to have somewhere that I could tell those young moms who are working full time where they could go to house themselves and their children safely.
Thanks, Erica. I mean, that sounds like a short-term and really immediate need that, you know, some issues on the housing front are more long-term conversations, but I think it's important to recognize that this is an issue impacting people now. So, you know, I think as a region, I think we need to be thinking long-term strategies. How do we improve the housing situation? But also, what are the stopgap measures to make sure that families like the ones you're working with have a place where they can live?
So when I think of stuff like
Josh,
that, oh, sorry. I was just going to add, I think that there are resources out there. So I don't know if this group can do that, but it's important to know what's your CAP agency doing, and then Josh and others.
Yeah, Josh, go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking that when we talk about affordable housing and we talk about workforce housing, you know, these things are actually defined. And there's also data sets that administrators sort of need to rely on to make sure that the housing we provide meets some of those requirements. And if you're thinking of for this group, I would strongly recommend that you include things like, what does workforce housing actually mean? And it really is low-income housing, tax credit housing. And what are the eligibility criteria for that? You know, all of these things are sort of easily consumed. And there's a lot of data sets available, and things like the area of median incomes for our region. And you can then also look at what some of the projections are for incomes and employment over time. Because I think and I know on the last time we met, and a lot of George's data help us sort of wrap our minds around what we mean when we're talking about housing. I think it would be really helpful to have the actual data sets for people to kind of look at, so that when we talk about things like affordable housing and workforce housing, we actually are saying the same thing.
Yeah, I agree. I think having a common link, that's something that's come up, I think, a couple of times during this meeting, is, you know, establishing a common language that, you know, folks who are interested in moving housing issues forward, you know, have to communicate with each other, and it helps us make sure we're on the same page. You know, as you know, we're about 20. It's tough. I think there's maybe room and interest in more conversation. You know, before we start losing more attendees, because we are running a bit over right now, I do want to take a moment to thank George and Sarah for taking time out of their day to come speak with us and share some of their thoughts about housing and housing advocacy across the state, and in other regions nearby. It's really useful for setting the stage, I think, for this effort, and I think puts us in a good position for having taking some next steps at a subsequent roundtable discussion, and kind of dive in a bit more detail into specific topics attendees are interested in discussing in a group setting. So thanks again to George and Sarah. And I also, you know, want to recognize again that you know, we are about 20 minutes over, and maybe I'll open up the floor once more for comments and questions. But I think there's you know, interest and lots of material ripe for discussion at a follow-up meeting. So keep your eyes peeled for a message in your are available, and I'll also plan on maybe following up with folks about specific topics folks would be interested in discussing. So I'm seeing some folks in the chat saying they have to hop off. Unless anyone has any burning final thoughts, I think we might be at the end of our kickoff meeting here.